Okay. Thank you for joining us for our garden class. So glad everybody's here. And this is our winter garden class. We're kind of preparing for the garden. And we have wonderful Gabriel here.
Well, not quite winter anymore.
Well, yeah, spring garden. Getting ready for a garden. Yes, right. So if you're not here, you missed out on the food. So it's yummy.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. It's amazing.
So anyway, so I'm going to hand it over to Gabrielle, and she's going to introduce, and thank you so much.
Sonia. Sonia. I feel like I have a mom here when I come here.
With all the food.
It's so nice. So anyway, introducing myself again. I'm a volunteer for the UC Lake County Master Gardener Program. And so are these three ladies here. We are from 4 distinctly different microclimates of Lake County. So they may chime in with some information for how things, work where they are. So, and if you have any questions that do not pertain to what I'm immediately talking about, please save them for the end of the class, right? I'm happy to answer them, but I'm going to stick to questions that pertain to what I'm talking about during class. And I'm going to be eating a lot of cough drops because I have allergies, so excuse me when I have to take a cough drop or tea break. I looked around a little bit. Our class today, maybe before I get into the matter, I have business cards here that have our phone number and address on it. So we don't have official help desk hours anymore. However, we have a office manager in our office that takes anybody's information and passes it on to master gardeners. So you can call our office with any kind of gardening question. Doesn't even have to be food gardening. So any gardening related question, and a master gardener will get back to you as soon as they can. The number's on there. I'm gonna put, you can pass it around, right? And I may want to add that as master gardeners, we're not allowed to recommend any particular brand name products. We're not allowed to recommend brand name businesses. So please don't ask me, what's your favorite nursery? What's your favorite soil mix? What's your favorite? I cannot answer that question. At least not in my function as a master gardener, okay? This class is about soils, soil health, soil improvement, and that will include composting. So we're not going to go into every little detail about composting today. But remember, any question you have that doesn't get answered in this class and does not get answered in any of the handouts we have here, you can call this number that you now have, right? So what is soil? Is my first question. Has anybody ever asked themselves what soil is, or do you have a pretty clear picture about what soil actually is? There's 2 different terms we use a lot in conjunction with planting vegetables. One term is soil and the other term is growing medium. Okay. Now the difference is soil is a living organism, something that has evolved for a while, even if it's only a few months, right? But soil means it consists of, ground down minerals originally from the bedrock, organic matter that has been over time deposited onto it and incorporated onto it, air, water, and microbes. And that is the crucial difference between soil and growing medium, right? Even though soil is technically also a growing medium. But soil is the growing medium that's alive, right? And what makes it alive is those microbes in it. Not just the microbes, there is actually things that we can see in it. There's earthworms in it and other decomposers, like soldier fly larvae in your compost, those little roly-polies, There's all kinds of critters in there that decompose. And that's what makes the soil alive. And it's not just a cute thing, but in nature this is actually necessary, because in nature there's no such thing as synthetic nitrogen fertilizer that you that gets dumped from the sky when the plant needs nitrogen, right? In nature, the fertilizer all comes from basically something that fell on the soil that is now being taken apart by microorganisms into its constituents. And then the minerals in there are being chelated so they can be uptaken by plants as a nutrient. And the way that happens in nature is typically there's no mixing happening on a grand scale with big tools, right? So we like to till our soil in the beginning to get going. In nature, tilling is only or something akin to tilling is only happening. You can imagine a herd of wild pigs going through an orchard, right? They are actually tilling, literally. But not many other animals are tilling the soil in such a rapid way. Naturally, it happens usually in a much slower way. And the way soil gets structured in nature is, number one, through the roots that grow through it. The roots growing in the soil are creating channels in that soil. As the roots decompose, they're leaving those air spaces. So the channels are still there even when the roots are rotting. Then little critters are burrowing through the soil. Sometimes bigger critters such as ground squirrels and moles and voles and you name it. But for the most part, it's larvae of insects, earthworms. Earthworms do a lot of the tilling, what we would call tilling of the soil. But a big part of it is done by the plant roots themselves. And that, of course, is a process that takes a lot longer than taking a shovel or a cultivator. However, it has the advantage that as opposed to taking a mechanical cultivator or a shovel, it doesn't destroy the already nicely built up structure in the soil. There is millions of microbial communities living there, fungi living in there, actinomycetes, which is kind of something between a fungus and a bacteria. It's an aggregate of bacteria that forms kind of a filament that looks almost like the hyphae of fungi. And these organisms get disrupted in a major way when we're tilling. It takes literally weeks for them to build up their active working communities again after we till the soil. So doing that repeatedly is not a good thing. The other thing that happens with tilling, because the tiller destroys a lot of that material, rips it up, kills a lot of microorganisms in the process, a lot of it just through exposing it to the air. That means that whatever organic material is in that soil will be used up and decompose much faster when we till than when the plant roots and the worms or just, a little digging shovel move the soil around a little bit.
So there's also that hard pan that gets developed if a soil
Exactly.
garden is continuously tilled, because the silt goes down and makes a...
Bingo. Did you all hear what Charlene said? The tiller, typically, the tines of the tiller are only so long. So that means those upper 6 inches of the soil are being literally pulverized by the tiller, whereas where those tines stop underneath, that doesn't get touched at all. So you have that pulverized stuff on the top 6 inches, and then at that point where the tiller doesn't reach, a hard layer develops because it's never being moved, and that's not good, right?
Gabriel, does that prevent drainage?
Exactly.
Okay.
It not just that, but it also prevents the flow of soil life. Like worms will eventually not try to burrow down there anymore. It just disrupts the natural layers of the soil, because natural soil has layers. We call them horizons technically, but I'm not going to use a lot of technical jargon today. But in nature, there's horizons in the soil. At the bottom is the bedrock down there, far down there. And then the next layer up would be rock that's already decomposed a little bit, into big pieces, smaller pieces, gravel. Then as you come further up, the further you come up, the more decomposed that soil is. It's now there in form of powder, basically. In Germany, you can buy a bag of rock powder. It's called rock flour because it literally has the consistency of flour at some point. So this rock flour or powder consists of minerals. You know, that's the mineral part of the soil. I don't want to say not alive because we can argue about what's alive and what's not alive. Let's just say the part that's less alive, right? The mineral part of the soil. And the further we come up to the surface, the more alive parts are in there. And the alive parts are soil organic matter that are in various stages of aliveness, right? It may not be actively alive anymore, but it has once been alive. The definition of soil organic matter is everything that has once been alive and may still be or not, right? So whether it was a plant, an animal, an insect, any of that stuff constitutes soil organic matter. So this soil organic matter is what makes something soil instead of just rock dust or just gravel. This is what creates the living soil.
So Gabriel, if someone inherited a garden that had been tilled and has a hard pan, what is their remedy? A bigger tiller or a spading fork?
Double digging.
Cover crop.
Yeah, well, there's various ways to go about it, okay? The old-fashioned way that I learned was to double dig. Double dig means basically 2 spades deep. And this is a specific process that I'm not going to go into because that's actually a class by itself that I would have to show you how this works. But basically you have a certain technique to dig the soil up 2 spades deep. You only have to do this once. This is not something that you would do every year. You only do this once if you have hard pan, if you're starting out with like super heavy clay soil. And then once you've dug it up, what you then want to do is keep it somewhat loose, okay? And the easiest, laziest way to do that is by grow things that have really deep roots that will keep their roots in there and keep that loose. In agriculture, in commercial agriculture, they've recently been using something that's called tiller radish. All it is a type of daikon radish that has super deep roots. It's not a good tasting radish. It's just used for loosening up the soil really deeply. When I was in Germany, there was fields of it where you could see that radish rotting in place over winter. So they grow the whole field with this, I don't know if they call it tiller radish there, it doesn't really matter.
I've heard it called digger.
Digger radish. It's a radish that's quite coarse and goes really deep.
And it's white.
It's white, yeah, it's a daikon type. And you grow that in the fall and then you leave it in place and over winter it rots in place. So what happens is that radish is a good size root, you know. So where that radish root was, there will be an airspace. And guess what? When there is a space, it will get filled with things. You know, critters, plant roots will go, other plant roots that would never have the force to get that far down. They can now get that far down because the space has already been created by that radish root, right? So the next crop that gets planted there in spring has a much easier time getting their roots into that soil. So that's one way to do it. And in the home vegetable garden, I've only done that once because I'm one of those people who grows year-round in my beds. I want to grow, you know, either edible stuff or short-lived cover crops year-round because I want to use my limited bed space for food as much as I can. So it's something that you may or may not, you know, want to do for practical reasons, but I'm saying that's just one way to do it. But even if you don't grow the tiller radish, I always like to grow something in the soil. I don't leave it fallow. So fallow soil very, very soon becomes dead, for lack of a better word, right? If you don't grow anything in the soil, the microbes will start dying off fairly quickly because the microbes and the plant roots live in synergy together. What does synergy mean? Synergy means both parties benefit. The microbes are getting something from the plant roots and the plant roots are getting something from the microbes. The microbes are getting sugars and acids from the plant roots that they can use. Wow. And the plants are getting nutrients pre-processed for them by the microbes that they could otherwise not uptake in the form that they're available in the soil. So the microbes are pre-chelating the nutrients for the plants that they can then uptake, you know, in a form that's bioavailable to them.
And I grow vetch and peas for...
Exactly. So Judy, thank you. So you can, there's many different cover crops. I have lists if you're interested, but basically they get grouped into summer and winter cover crops. And there's other subgroupings. There's part of cover crops that are in the legume family, and they fix nitrogen in the soil. However, it's not really the legume itself that fixes the nitrogen in the soil. It's the bacteria that live in synergy with those leguminous roots that fix the nitrogen. So if you grow these legumes in a bed or in an area that has never had legumes growing, there's a good chance they may not be fixing nitrogen in your soil because the bacteria that are necessary for this synergistic process are not there. Modern gardening has a solution for that. They sell you the inoculant in a little bag at the garden center, right? So you can pre-inoculate, like let's say you just built a house and your house is surrounded by construction debris. Nothing has ever been grown in that, especially not vegetables, right? So in this construction debris type of stuff, it's very unlikely you're going to find the right bacteria to make your legumes fix nitrogen. So in that case, I would recommend to buy an inoculant, right? However, in my gardening beds, I have grown legumes so many times in there that I know those bacteria are in there. I don't bother to inoculate anymore. So anyway, we were talking about cover crops. The legumes fix the nitrogen from the air in the soil with the help of the bacteria that live in their root system. And legumes don't have a very sturdy root system otherwise. They don't have very deep roots, you know, like if you imagine a radish root, legumes usually have fairly shallow root system. So the benefit of the legumes is the nitrogen fixing. It's not the deep tilling. For the deep tilling, you need something like radishes. Now, if you want to create a lot of root mass in a short time, you want grasses. Grasses as a cover crop, you know, grasses have really dense, fairly shallow root systems, at least in the first year. So if you have grasses in your cover crop mix, that will create a really thick, dense root mass. And most cover crop mixes are a little bit of everything. They have a few grasses in there, they have a few legumes in there. Some of them may have some radishes in there too. So depending on what you're trying to do, you can pick a mix of cover crops or just a single one. And there's lists to tell you what each one of them is good for.
Is this peas that are in here right now?
So what's in those beds right now are fava beans.
Oh, fava beans. Yeah.
Those are peas. Those are peas on the right side,
Yep.
but there's fava beans on the left side. Now, I want to say something to those beds, okay? A cover crop is called cover crop because it literally covers the whole bed. What's growing in there is not a cover crop. It's 3 plants. This is not how you grow a cover crop, you know?
But would that be a good...
Yes, that would be a fantastic cover crop. I grow fava beans every year. They make a fantastic cover crop because they get big and fill up the space fast. But you need about like 40 plants in there.
Okay.
We're not talking 4 plants. You need 40 plants in that bed, right? And you put the beans in there and, you know, you sow the fava beans in October. You can do succession sowings. Yeah.
Okay.
Not now, obviously.
No.
It's a
But
cold
not
weather.
September.
It's a cold weather cover crop. Yeah.
A lot.
They don't do well in the summer. Now there's summer cover crops also in case you go on vacation but you want to plant something to keep your beds covered. Like in the summer, buckwheat would be a really good cover crop, you know, that can take high heat. So anyway, where was I? We go on a lot of tangents there because one thing you realize when you garden, everything is connected to everything. So no matter what you talk about, you end up on 10 different subjects because it's somehow connected, right? So we were talking about soil and how to make your soil better, right? first of all, I want to clarify two terms that I may be using: soil texture and soil structure. It sounds like it's the same thing, but it's not. Soil texture, when we talk about soil texture, we're talking about the different components that make up the soil in the mineral aspect of it. Like soil is made up of clay, loam, sand to various degrees. And how much proportion we have of each of those determines the soil texture. That's something that's very hard to change, your soil texture, unless you put tons of amendments in over the years. It's not something you can change very quickly. The soil structure, however, is something that is created by the work of the microorganisms and the plant roots on the material, and that can be changed for the better fairly quickly, right? And that includes your manual work with a little hoe or whatever, that can also change soil structure, right? But permanently, soil structure gets made better by the addition of soil organic material, which could be compost, could be just decomposing straw, could be just the residue from your last crop. So everything that was once alive, remember, is soil organic material. That is what improves the structure. Improving the texture can also be done, but it's a much, much more difficult undertaking. Now, I don't know how many of you garden in raised beds like this versus in the ground. How many of you garden in? Yep, many, right? I do, because my ground is not good enough to really grow vegetables in. So when you grow in a raised bed like that, a lot of that is kind of irrelevant, because you go out and you buy yourself some perfect soil and then you fill your bed with it. So you already have a way head start over anybody who has to, dig up the hard ground, right? But still, even when you start out like, I did with a raised bed just like that and perfect soil, that soil will deteriorate over the years fairly quickly if you don't do things to maintain it, right? So in this case, you don't have to work that much on the soil texture because you already started out with perfect texture. You don't have any hard clay in there or any other problems, no hard pan. But what you have to continuously work on is the soil structure, even in a raised bed, because it does compact. Now, one thing which is nice in raised beds is you're not likely to step on it. What the mistake most people make that garden in the soil, they don't realize you're never supposed to step on your gardening bed. That's the first mistake. Compacting the soil by stepping on it is a no-no. It creates problems, right? And then you have to dig it up again to loosen it up again. So on a raised bed like that, you're very unlikely to step on it, unless, like you're unlucky like I grow things in an oak forest. And even though my beds are all lined with hardware cloth, the oak roots get in there from the bottom. So I have to double dig every bed every year to get the oak roots out. That's not something you would ordinarily have to do, but I have to do that. And sometimes I have to stand on it because I just, I have to get down there to dig. But by the time I'm done with it, it's all nicely fluffed up again. So that's a lot of work every year. If I would do it again, I would put a layer of something else at the bottom, if I would start from scratch again, having, knowing what I know now. But I didn't.
Would rock help, like little peat gravel at the bottom? Would that help?
No, the oak roots will get through peat gravel, yeah. You literally need an impenetrable barrier, like concrete or,
wow,
something like that.
4 inches of concrete.
Huh? Yeah, well, I don't want to get too much into that. We could talk a lot about how to make raised beds now, but I'm just talking about maintaining and improving the structure of your soil is a continuous process. Continuous, right? And ordinarily, if you're like me, I grow things in my beds all year round. They never lay fallow. If you must leave them fallow for a while, you have to at least cover the soil with some organic material. And that could be, let's say you grew tomatoes, was the last thing you grew before you stopped growing in that bed. Well, after you harvested all the tomatoes, then roughly chop up your tomato plants and cover the whole bed with the tomato plants. And then maybe throw an old army tarp over it or something like that. So at least the soil is covered. The soil organisms have something to feed on, meaning the decaying plant material. So your soil stays alive and active while you're not growing something actively in it. So that's the least you should do if you don't grow a cover crop. Just at least throw a bunch of organic material in. We're talking thick, 6 inches on top.
Would hay help?
Hay would help too. I mean, anything is better than nothing on top. Anything is better than nothing.
Just get sterilized hay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, make sure there's no weed seeds in it, because you can create a big problem if you have hay with weed seeds in it. You may never get rid of that again, right? So either like rice straw is good, because rice straw usually you don't have that problem, or if you have certified weed-free hay.
Right.
Or you just don't mind pulling all the weeds out in spring when you're starting again, right? But anything you put on top is better than nothing. Soil in nature is always covered, you noticed, right? That's why weeds exist. Weeds exist because nature found a spot of bare soil and immediately tries to cover it. And weeds, or what we call weeds, are just the kind of plants that are hardier than our preferred plants. If you would wait till one of your favorite plants covers that soil, that can take weeks. Whereas what we call a weed is a plant that can cover everything in 1 week. No problem, right? Without watering or anything. And that's exactly the function of weeds, is to keep soil covered, because that is the most important thing to keep it alive. And so I have started some years ago to take advantage of that fact by, instead of buying expensive cover crop mixes, I realized you can use anything as a cover crop. I mean, literally almost anything. Of course, I try to use something as a cover crop that's easy to get rid of when I'm done with it, right? I would not want to use Bermuda grass or something that you can't get rid of it anymore. So you want something that you can easily pull out and dispose of it when you're done with it, right? But last year I've grown in 2 beds. In 1 bed I grew calendula flowers as a cover crop. It's beautiful. It helps the insects find, because they bloom almost all winter long. Excuse me. So the insects have some place to go in the winter. On a sunny day, they go to the calendula flowers. Also, I make herbal medicine, so I collect the flowers, not all of them, but some of them, and I dry them for my, herbal medicine. And they're nice to look at, right? And when I'm done with it, they're easy to pull out. And if some seeds stay in there, no big deal. That's a beautiful thing, right? It's not something that I'm trying to get rid of. And then I grew another bed with nothing but tagetes flowers. It's also something we call commonly marigold, but it's a completely different. Tagetes is the type of marigold that basically fumigates your soil. It doesn't really fumigate. I'm jokingly calling that, but it deters nematodes. Tagetes, they exude something from their root system that deters nematodes. And this was a bed where I used to have tomatoes in a couple years ago, and I had a big nematode problem. So I decided this last winter, as a cover crop, I grew the entire bed in the fall with tagetes to get as Tagetes. And the particular species I used was called Tagetes patula. It's the low-growing one, also called French marigold. French marigold is usually the common name. It's a very strong-smelling plant. You can tell right away there's something really strong in it. Unlike the calendula, is a very soft, non-strong-smelling plant. The Tagetes is a very strong-smelling plant, and this plant exudes things, material from their root system that deters nematodes. If you don't know what nematodes are, they are tiny little worms that eat your plant roots. You don't want them in your. There's beneficial There's beneficial nematodes and not so beneficial nematodes. But the ones that we usually have problems with are the ones that eat the root system of your plants, And to get rid of those. Now, this is something that most people don't realize. You cannot just have a big bed like that and pop one French marigold in there and think that solves the nematode problem, okay? That's not how it works. You need to grow several of those in that bed for at least one entire season before there is enough of that stuff in there to deter the nematodes. So these natural remedies are not instant. It's not like a medicine that you take and 2 hours later the problem is solved, right? No, you need a season's worth of root exudate from that plant before there is a sufficiently nematode deterring effect. And I thought, well, what better to just use it as a cover crop over the winter. I planted the whole bed in tagetes, and they almost all came up. And now I'm getting rid of them, and I can plant my first spring crop in there, and there's not going to be any nematodes in there, right? So just letting you know that you can use many things that are not official cover crops as a cover crop, depending on what you're planning to do. I also planted one entire bed with parsley as a cover crop, because parsley does really well in the winter where I am.
Yes, it does.
Right? And it's something that even if you forget to pull it out on time, big deal, then you have some parsley seeds in there. It's not anything you're going to worry about, right? It's not going to take over, it's not going to get invasive, and if it does, that's a good thing, right? And the good part about it is I can harvest a little bit of it whenever I need some parsley. So it's a cover crop that also gives me a little bit of herbal edible material. So just expand your mind on cover crops and don't think you need to buy that cover crop that's called cover crop in the nursery for a lot of money. If you have some old parsley seeds, some old marigold seeds, throw a handful of those in there and makes a perfect cover crop, right? And you can mix and match. So it's one way to keep your soil covered, meaning keeping it alive. Because remember what I said, the microbes only stay alive when they have plants that they can synergistically interact with. So if you take nothing else from this class but that insight, it will be worth it, believe me. That is the most important message from the whole class. Of course, we can get into 100 other details, right? So the difference.
Cover crop.
Yeah.
Then do you want to double dig the cover crop, or do you just?
Thank you for asking. See, another thing I forgot to mention. I'm so happy when people ask questions because it reminds me of stuff I forgot to say. When we have a cover crop, it's not like a commercial agricultural business. They just take a tiller at the end of the cover crop season and till it under. And then after you till it under, it takes about 6 weeks for it to rot before you can plant in there, right? Now, we're not commercial agriculture people. So first of all, I don't want to use a tiller in my bed. And secondly, most people don't have one anyway, right? So what I usually do, depending on what kind of cover crop it is, most cover crops, I simply cut at the soil surface, right? And then chop them up and put them in the composter. And then you still have the entire root system of that cover crop in the soil, and I leave it in there because it will decompose in the soil and provide nutrients for the microbes that are already living in it, just like it would happen in nature. And the top of it gets chopped up, comes in the composter, and will eventually be used as compost on top. Sometimes in the summer, I chop it up and just use it as mulch right away on top. So if you don't want to compost it, use it as mulch somewhere, right? That's how I usually deal with cover crops. Did that answer your question?
That's good.
And depending on what cover crop you're dealing with, sometimes you notice that if you just cut it at soil level, it will resprout if the conditions are favorable. Like I cut all my fava beans in February before I went out of the country. I cut all my fava beans at soil level and transplanted my onions into it. The onion seedlings I had started in October, and by mid-February they were ready for transplanting into their final growing place. So I cut all the beds that I had in fava bean cover crop, cut all the fava beans at soil level, left the roots in, and planted my onion seedlings in between the fava beans. Well, when I came back from vacation, I realized that a lot of the fava beans had resprouted from the root system, right? So I had to cut them one more time. No big deal. But I just left them in place as mulch. I didn't even bother to, whichever one resprouted got cut back again and left as mulch in between the onions. Now, just to mention aside, this has nothing to do with today's topic, but while I think about it, onions do not like competition, okay? I have found they're best grown in a bed with nothing else. And they always say, oh, grow your onions, especially not weeds, right?
Including weeds, yeah.
Including weeds, yeah. But they don't even like, I do a lot of companion planting, but I find with onions, I don't do companion planting. Because if you do companion planting with onions, the onions always get the short end of the stick. So while the onions can be beneficial for the other plant that are in the bed, the other plant is usually not beneficial for the onions, I found. They don't do well with competition. So I grow them in a bed where I used to have fava beans in there, where the roots of the fava beans are decomposing, nourishing the onions. And whatever fava beans resprout get chopped and deposited as mulch. But I don't grow other stuff in that bed. I find the onions do better just by themselves. That was an aside. It's not about soil. But I thought I'd mention it. So now what else can we do to make our soil better or keep the quality of our soil? We add things that are called soil amendments, right? What's the difference between soil amendments and fertilizer? Does anybody know? Any takers?
I bet amendments are organic in nature and fertilizer are more mineral.
Not necessarily.
They add texture.
Yeah,
Structure, usually. Yes, Charlene. So amendments are things that we add to improve the structure of the soil. Sometimes the texture too, but most of the time in this case here it would be the structure. And the difference between, another important difference is that fertilizers contain macronutrients in very concentrated form. That's what we're paying for. When we buy a fertilizer, we're paying for the macronutrients, which are NPK, standing for N is nitrogen, P is phosphorus, K is potassium. These are the macronutrients. There are some other nutrients that could be considered macronutrients, such as calcium or sulfur, but they usually are not on the three numbers on the fertilizer. So whenever you buy a fertilizer, it will always have those three numbers on the package. And the first number is always nitrogen, the second number is always phosphorus, the third number is always potassium, right? And then, of course, a lot of fertilizer have trace minerals too, and other things, and things like calcium, sulfur, etc., etc. But the fertilizer is basically a very concentrated dose of nutrients, whereas the amendment is not a concentrated dose of nutrients. It's something to improve the structure that may already also have nutrients. But the nutrients are not the main point of an amendment. The main point of an amendment is to improve the soil structure. And if it had nutrients, that's an added plus, right? So to give you some examples, we have organic and inorganic soil amendments. And I want to qualify right here, the term organic in the English language has two distinctly different meanings that most people use interchangeably in the wrong way. So what I'm talking about is soil organic matter is everything that was once alive or is still alive. So in chemical terms, organic simply means has once been alive. That's all it means. It has nothing to do with the certified organic that you pay extra for when you buy vegetables that are certified organically grown, which means they adhere to the certified organic standard growing conditions, right? So when you buy compost from some suppliers, as an example, they will say, this compost is 100% organic. And it's not a lie, because compost, by definition, is soil organic material. It was once alive. Does not mean it's certified organic. That's a total different thing. The compost is 100% organic, but it's not certified organic, usually. Yeah?
What is pesticides? What is it?
What is pesticides?
Yeah.
That's a whole other class that I'm happy to answer after this class for you. Pesticides is basically anything you use to kill an insect that you don't like is a pesticide. It can be a synthetic product, Or it can be something like garlic juice can also be used as a pesticide, you know. The definition of pesticide is simply something you're using to kill insects you don't like. That's a pesticide. Huh?
Herbicide is.
Yeah, and an herbicide is something you use to kill plants you don't like. That's an herbicide, right? So organic soil amendments, when I talk about organic soil amendments, I'm not talking about certified organic materials. I'm simply talking about materials that were once alive. That's when I say organic, right? So compost is always organic, whether it's certified organic or not. It's always organic in the sense that it's soil organic matter. And compost is probably the best soil amendment you can ever choose. If you're in doubt what to add compost, right? There's only one caveat. Your growing medium in your bed, I'm calling it growing medium because it's not naturally evolved soil in there. Your growing medium should not be more than 50% compost. Yes?
What's the definition of compost?
Compost is, I have a definition somewhere in these handouts, but if I can't find it right now, I'm gonna try to tell you as best as I recall. It's basically organic material that has been deliberately assembled for rapid decomposition under ideal circumstances. That's the definition of compost.
If you see on page 3, you can find
It's somewhere in your handouts.
yeah.
Okay, good. So back to amendments. So compost is my favorite amendment. As long as you don't make it more than 50% of what's in your bed, it's always the best amendment. It has many good things. There's many good things it does, which I could talk about by itself for another hour. But one of the good things it does is it balances the pH of your growing medium. Compost always balances the pH. And talking about soil tests, okay, many people think the first thing they need to do before they grow anything is to take a soil test. Now, if you buy a new piece of property that you have no idea what's under your shoes, right, then that may be a good idea if you're planning to seriously grow vegetables, to do a soil test. However, if your garden consists of raised beds of various sizes, with growing mediums coming from various different suppliers that have been amended at various different times with various things, then in order for a soil test to make sense, you would have to do a soil test from every one of those beds. And do you have any idea what that would cost? Yeah. And I'm not talking about that little soil test that you buy at the hardware store that gives you an approximate number of the bioavailable macronutrients. Those tests are almost useless, okay? First of all, they're not very accurate. We had a speaker from pharmacology labs at our master gardener training once, and she said those soil tests, including the pH tests that you can buy at the hardware store, are very inaccurate and almost useless because there's a lot of things they don't tell you about your soil. And you, who are already perfectly clear about what soil actually is and how nutrients in the soil cycle, you could already probably tell me why that soil test is useless. Can you imagine? So what that soil test measures is just the bioavailable macronutrients in the soil at the given time of the soil test, right? But you already know that, for instance, most of the nitrogen in a good organic soil is available in form of not completely processed soil organic matter, living and dead microorganisms. This nitrogen will not show up on a soil test. There's huge amount of, nitrogen in there in form of compost that's still completely being broken down by microorganisms, including those microorganisms themselves. Guess what? They're full of nitrogen. If you want to see a parallel between our nutrients and plant nutrients, you can look at it as nitrogen is like protein in our nutrition. And carbs are it's the same for plants, you know. The nitrogen, the compost is made out of browns and greens, and we're going to go more into compost later. Compost is a mix of browns and greens. Greens are not always green in color. Greens is just a term we use for fresh, juicy, nitrogen-rich material. That's what we call greens. And that could be orange in form of orange pulp from your juicer. We would still call it greens. It's fresh, juicy, nitrogen-rich. Coffee grinds are very nitrogen-rich, yet they're not green-looking, they're brown. But coffee grounds are not a brown, they're a green because they're nitrogen-rich. Whereas straw is a brown because it's carbon-rich, right? So for the plants, it's like protein and carbs. Nitrogen is where the protein is. And guess where the protein is in soil? It's in the living organisms, of course. That's the meat in the soil, is the bacteria, the worms, all the other creepy crawlies that are alive or dead in various stages of alive or dead. That's where the protein, the nitrogen is, right? So if you do a soil test, it's not measuring all that, you know? So your soil test is really very inaccurate. And the reason why I usually don't recommend it is if anybody has successfully grown vegetables on that soil, you already know that soil is good enough for growing vegetables. Why bother doing a soil test? And you already know what you have to do with it to keep it that way and make it better, with or without a soil test, right? So the only time it makes sense to spend the money on a soil test, and if you really do a soil test, don't do the NPK soil test. You wanna do one of the $160 soil tests that checks for everything, not just NPK. That is worth doing, but most people aren't willing to invest that, you know, and you may not need to. But if you're just doing the NPK, it's a complete waste of money, I think, you know.
You were saying that compost balances the pH, but I
Yes.
thought it was acidic. Compost was acidic.
No, compost is not acidic. Compost balances the pH. And what is it in the compost that balances the pH? The microorganisms. They work at balancing the pH, right? So there is acidic soil amendments. And if you go to a new property where no vegetables have ever been grown and you want to grow food, then it makes sense to do a soil test for no other reason, or nothing else, just the pH would be a good thing to find out, right? Because above a certain pH, things can't be grown, and below a certain pH, things can be grown.
Neutral, right?
Well, you don't want a neutral. Most vegetables actually thrive in a pH between 6.3 and 7 or so, right? But some of them like it a little more sour and some of them like it a little bit more alkaline, and you can look that up on a chart. Like, to give you an example, potatoes like it on the sour side, right? So if you grow potatoes in an alkaline soil, they get these rot spots, these brown rot spots. And it's not a disease, a pest, it's the alkaline soil that does that, right? So certain vegetables have certain pH requirements, and you can read up about that before you grow it. In Lake County, most of the soils, especially where I live, are exceedingly alkaline. The pH is up to 8 or over 8, which is super alkaline, meaning not good for vegetables. So if you have a high pH like that, what do you do to get the pH down? You need a soil amendment that makes the soil more acidic. And that would be...
It's a hard one to correct.
Yeah, it's not that hard. You buy elemental sulfur.
I don't know.
It's called elemental sulfur.
There was something in the rock bed underneath, no matter what I did. It would
Uh-huh.
last for maybe a season.
Yeah.
and then it
I mean, if you're out where I live, the soil is so alkaline, you could throw bags and bags of
Yes.
elemental sulfur in it to correct that. But there's so many other problems with it that I don't even bother. I just made a raised bed and I bought good soil, right? 'Cause sometimes it's not worth it'll take years of amendments to change your soil for the better. And the question is that something you want to invest the time and work into, or you just want to cheat and start out with perfect soil, right? That's up to everybody. Now, as alkaline as the soil is, most fruit trees still do okay with it. I grow fruit trees in my, native soil, and they do fine. Of course, I amend like crazy from the top all the time, but they can handle that. So elemental sulfur is an amendment to turn the soil more acidic. If you want to grow blueberries or or azaleas, rhododendrons, you need acidic soil. So this would be an amendment that you would, add to make your soil more acidic. Now, pine needles also are slightly acidifying, but pine needles take years to acidify your soil because they break down very slowly. So it's not something where you're going to see an immediate difference at all. Years and years worth of pine needles are going to slowly acidify the soil. That's why most conifer forests have very acidic soil, because there's decades worth of rotting pine needles in there, and that's why the soil is acidic, right? But we don't have conifer forests in the area I am. There's oaks, and they do okay in alkaline soil. So manure as an amendment really depends, right? There's so many different manures. Some of them are a great amendment and some are not. There's people who raise rabbits and alpacas, and those are probably the two only kinds of manure that you can add into your soil as is without composting. It's not going to hurt anything. It delivers nutrients and improves the soil. Whereas most manures need to be composted, or at least need to sit for a couple months before you add them to the soil, because they are either highly acidic or have high levels of nitrogen that can burn the roots of your plants. So another problem, that is actually not the main problem with manure. I find the main problem with a lot of manures is, especially the horse manure we get for free everywhere here in Lake County. Guess what? It's full of weed seeds, and the kind of weeds you really don't want in your garden, right? So I'm not a big fan of it. If you use it, cover it up with bark mulch at least 6 inches, because otherwise you have nothing but weeds sprouting out of it. And those weeds, as they grow up, will use up all the nutrients that were in that horse manure. So you actually end up with a negative nutrient quotient after you're done pulling out the damn weeds out of the manure, right? So you're actually not doing anything good for your soil. No. You could bury the horse manure really deep in what the French used to do in the early spring. They used to create heated beds with horse manure because there was no electrical heating mats at the time, right? So they would create a raised bed that had horse manure at the bottom and then soil on top. And the horse manure, as it was decomposing, would create heat. So they could plant vegetables much earlier than they otherwise could because the soil was warm from the horse manure, right? But the horse manure was deep down enough that the seeds in it wouldn't sprout and interfere with the vegetables growing. So there's ways around it, right? But otherwise, when somebody offers you free horse manure, keep that in mind. It's the reason why it's free. The other problem it can have, people give their horses dewormers on a regular basis. You know that, right? Horses are being dewormed. So the dewormer residue is often still in the horse manure. So when that horse manure hasn't composted long enough, you're killing all the earthworms in your soil if you're adding that horse manure with residual dewormer in your garden. So this is another thing to keep in mind, right? And while I'm thinking about that, it used to happen often, not so much anymore because people are paying more attention now, but it used to happen often that people would buy the cheap compost from municipal composting facilities, sometimes even get it for free. And you know that compost that you get from municipal composting facilities is made out of people's grass clippings and, their ground up Christmas trees and whatnot, right? And especially the ones that's made from grass clippings in the summer, that has large amounts of herbicide residue in it, because most people spray their lawns with herbicide to keep the broadleaf weeds down. Well, guess what? That herbicide does not break down in the composting process. So people would get that stuff cheap and put it in their vegetable garden and literally kill all their vegetables with the herbicide residue in the free compost, right? So another thing to keep in mind, know where you get your compost from, know what it's made out of. Whether it's certified organic or not, it's beside the point, it's just an additional issue to keep in mind. So going on with the soil amendments, grape pomace. We live in a wine growing area. There's a lot of grape pomace available. It's mostly used actually by the wine growers themselves as a soil amendment, and they compost it themselves. But they used to also, I'm not sure if they still do in Lake County, they used to also sell it and give it away for growers. Now, grape pomace still has a very high sugar residue in it, right? And there was a case, this was years ago already, but I remember it was used by one of those salad farms on the coast. They used grape pomace on their salad farm, and they had an E. coli outbreak that was traced back to compost made with that grape pomace. And the problem was because that's so high in sugar. Sugar feeds bacteria, but not just the good bacteria, obviously. So if you have some E. coli in your growing system and you add something that's high sugar to it, it will also feed the E. coli, obviously, right? And lettuce is a crop where that's so close to the ground where it can easily come in contact with things like that. So this was something that happened many years ago. I'm just mentioning it. If you're using that, keep that in mind. It's hard to get here, I think, by now, because most of the vineyards use it themselves. Peat moss, we all know peat moss because it's a part of most commercial grow mixes. Exactly, I was stumbling on the word. Growing mediums, I wanted to say, but grow mixes is another good word for it, right? And unfortunately, because peat bogs are a finite resource, we only have so many peat bogs. And people keep extracting the peat moss from the peat bogs. Well, sooner or later, there will be no more peat moss. And it's kind of sad, right? That's why master gardeners recommend coir, coconut fiber. It does the same thing. It's a renewable resource because coconuts are being grown in large amounts. And, you know, the outside of the coconut has that fibrous stuff. And that does everything which peat moss does, and it's a renewable resource. So we recommend don't use peat moss, use coconut fiber whenever you can. It does not act exactly like peat moss, but close enough, right? Biochar has been kind of one of those fancy, fashionable ingredients in the last 10 years. Yeah, well.
At 10,000 degrees.
Yeah, well.
Have to go to 10,000.
No. We have a big outdoor wood stove because we heat with wood, and if you burn your wood stove at a low smoldering temperature, it produces a lot of biochar. So my husband used to make biochar for me one winter long, large amounts of biochar. This was more than 10 years ago, because everybody had told me that's a wonder ingredient. Just add that biochar to your soil; it's going to make everything so much better, right? But what people forgot to mention is that biochar by itself is not the wonder ingredient alone. It needs to be charged with nutrients. Otherwise, it does nothing, right? Biochar is just a natural sponge that holds onto water and nutrient-rich water, you know, and then releases it over time in your soil. But if you're not charging that sponge, if you're not soaking that sponge with good stuff, then you're just having an empty sponge in there, and yeah, it traps some air in your soil, which is nice, but when I first used it, I'm like, I don't know, I didn't notice any difference, right? It was not the wonder ingredient that it was touted. And then I read up more on it, yeah.
What's the difference between biochar and ashes?
Biochar are little pieces of charcoal, right? Very light little pieces of charcoal. It's not ashes. So how you charge it, if this wasn't an official Master Gardener class, I know a really easy way to charge it, but I can't tell you that in an official Master Gardener class. Ask me after the class, right? So as a Master Gardener, actually the easiest way to charge it is with compost tea or compost. You throw some compost in a bucket and some water and make a slurry, and you soak your biochar in that really nutrient-rich liquid. That's how you charge it.
Okay.
Yeah.
We make a lot of biochar and we put it in our compost.
Yeah,
And
perfect.
we kind of turn it up.
Great.
And then we
That
put it.
exactly. So you're charging
How
it.
do you make biochar? I'll tell you later.
Yeah. This is not a biochar class, so we're not going to. But basically, yes, you're charging biochar with nutrient-rich liquid from compost, for instance. It's a great way.
If anybody saw that huge green machine that was in the fields at Middletown, that was, they were feeding logs from the cob fire into that
Yeah.
char
Maker.
machine.
Yeah.
And they threw just huge logs in there, 20, 30
Yeah.
feet long, and just
Yeah.
yeah, there was.
So once it's charged with nutrients, then it's a fantastic soil amendment, right?
Isn't it alkaline? Anytime you
Well,
add,
ashes are super alkaline.
but
Okay.
the charcoal is
The charcoal in itself may still be a little alkaline, but it's getting charged with that compost juice, which is definitely not alkaline. It's more on the acidic side usually. So that neutralizes it. So what I found using biochar in raised beds like that, because my beds are kind of like that, is that since I need to double dig my beds every year because of the oak roots, and the biochar pieces are much lighter than everything else in that growing mix, every year I end up with all the biochar pieces on top by the time I'm done digging, which is a real pain in the butt, right? So then I need to bury them again. So this is just something practical to keep in mind. If you're in a situation where you need to dig up your soil a lot, okay, especially at the time when the soil is maybe dry, you'll end up with all the biochar pieces on top.
good to hold the moisture though.
That's what it's for.
Yeah.
Biochar is for to hold the moisture. But if I dig up my relatively dried out soil now, the biochar has no more moisture in it.
Yeah.
It's as dry as the soil, and it thereby floats on top of the soil after I'm done digging. So then I have to make holes again and push that biochar down again, which is kind of, I don't know, I don't like it.
If you put uncharged biochar,
Yeah.
does it momentarily deplete the nutrition from your raised beds?
I couldn't tell you that. That's what you would logically think, right? Basically, if you put uncharged biochar in the bed and then you fertilize and water your bed, then the dissolved fertilizer in the water will get trapped in the biochar. Yeah. But it will also get released again over time, you know. So yeah, momentarily you might be, but this nutrient-rich liquid, if it wasn't for the biochar, would be running through your bed into the groundwater. So it's much better to trap it in the biochar than to have it run through the bed into the groundwater, right? Or even just into a lower strata of soil where it's not available to your vegetables anymore. So either way, I don't think it's a real problem. So keep in mind, if you want to work with biochar, it needs to be charged. Super important, right? Dry leaves. I love dry leaves as a soil amendment, but unfortunately all the oaks on my property are mostly blue oaks and live oaks. Now the live oaks have these razor sharp edges. I don't like to use those leaves because you literally hurt yourself every time you touch it. The blue oaks have leaves that are so hard and leathery that they need to be pre-composted before you can add them to anything. And I have a little samples here. Hang on a second, where are my samples? Okay, dried leaf mold, where's the other leaves? There's one missing. Anyway, this will do. So just to show you, after this is leaf mold but dried. Leaf mold is a kind of funny name. The reason it's called leaf mold is because when oak leaves fall off the trees and they lie there in a moist spot all winter long, fungi will infiltrate those moist oak leaves, and the fungi will start decomposing them. And so by spring you'll find these white little hyphae from the fungi in between the leaves, right? It's a sign that fungi have been starting to decompose. And then as the ground dries up, it'll look something like that. And you can pass that around. So you can see they're already partially decomposed. They don't look as hard and leathery anymore as they came off the tree. These are blue oak leaves. You can pass them around. You can also smell, because I want you to smell the difference between that and that. This coir too. Right. Coir, if anybody doesn't know what coir feels and looks like, pass that around. So this is what we would call leaf mold, except it's not moist anymore because we've already had so much hot weather. So all the stuff I gathered this morning was completely dried out already, right? Normally at this time of the year it would still be moist. So now I went to a forested part of the property and I put the upper soil away and I got a little deeper down, maybe 6 inches down. And I gathered from the layer of leaves and decomposing material between the oak trees, I gathered a few handful. This is what I call forest duff. I know it's kind of a cute name, right? So forest duff is basically that layer that forms under trees that hasn't been disturbed much, that has been decomposing over a period of like 2-3 years. So it's halfway decomposed, but you can still see parts of leaves. There's fungi in there, there's insect parts in there. So what this is, it's an inoculant. It's an inoculant that I use to make compost tea, for instance.
Okay. How about for the beans and peas that haven't grown in the soil? Would they a different kind of inoculant?
Peas don't grow in forests.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
This is a forest inoculant, you know. For peas, you need a very specific inoculant for legumes.
Okay,
I'm not saying it wouldn't be better than nothing.
right.
Absolutely, this would be better than nothing. But for peas, you're going to do better buying the specific bacteria that are needed
For that.
to create, to pull the nitrogen out of the soil, okay? But this is a great inoculant if you want to make compost tea, or just if you have a bed where the soil looks kind of dead and you want to get some good bacteria in there. You put a handful of that and mix it up well, make sure it stays moist. It'll introduce some good bacteria, right? So forest duff, you can, and smell it. It smells good. Right. So what is in this forest stuff would be mycorrhizal and bacterial inoculants. In a forest, you're going to have mostly mycorrhizal inoculants because bacteria actually don't do that well on forest floors. You have more fungal decomposition. Anywhere where there's trees, the majority of the decomposition is fungal based because bacteria cannot work with leathery oak leaves. You know, bacteria are not capable of decomposing a leathery oak leaves, but fungi are. So anytime you're in a forest where there's hard stuff falling from the tree, the decomposition is started mostly by fungi and is, you know, being worked mostly by fungi. Whereas in a vegetable garden or in a compost that's made mostly from vegetable scraps, the decomposition is done mostly by bacteria. Okay? And when you make compost, I'm calling them compost piles. That's another misnomer in Lake County. Because I come from Germany originally, you just throw things on a pile, and after half a year it's compost. That's why they used to be called compost piles, because it rained every other day, and there was no issue with the compost drying out. That was simply not an issue, right? So we called it a compost pile because it was literally a big pile, you know. But in Lake County, if you throw things on a pile, it's going to be dry in 2 days, and there will be zero decomposition happening unless you water it twice a day, right? So I don't like to call it compost piles here because it's really not the right word. Composting here can only happen successfully either in the cool season or in a closed container where you keep adequate moisture, right? And the moisture for decomposition needs to be 45%. And you're going to think, oh my God, how am I supposed to know whether it's 45% moisture? 45% moisture is exactly what a wrung out sponge feels like. When you have a sponge and you squeeze it, after you squeeze it, it will have 45% moisture. So when you grab a piece of your composting material, if it feels like a wrung out sponge, it has the right amount of moisture. You don't want it to be much drier and you don't want it to be much wetter. Because remember, the bacteria that decompose also need oxygen in there, right? If it's too wet, no oxygen goes in there. Then you have anaerobic decomposition, which is better than no decomposition, but it will smell bad, right? Anaerobic decomposition smells awful. It still decomposes, But if you want it to smell good, you need to keep oxygen in there so the aerobic bacteria go to work. So this inoculant that I passed around, I don't know where it is right now, you got it. It will be mostly fungal based, and so there will be mycorrhizae in there, right? Inorganic soil amendments, are you all getting tired already? See, the good news is you have all the information in your sheets, so whatever we don't cover, you can read at home, right?
Gabriel, quick time check, it's 12:25. Just to give
I think we have 25 minutes left only?
12:25.
Oh, it's 12:25. Okay. Do you need to make a break, or are you good for me talking? You can drink and eat while I'm talking. I'm not taking it personal, right? So take a break if you must. So the inorganic soil amendments are basically things that are not alive or weren't alive. Lime is something that's used a lot on the East Coast and in Europe because most of the soils there are acidic to start with. So they keep saying sweeten your soil with lime, right? It's not sweetening it. It's making it more alkaline, basically.
But if you tasted it,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be as sour.
Yeah. Well, the acidic soils are sour, and so this is gypsum, not lime. But what we want to use in most parts of Lake County instead of lime is gypsum. Lime is usually used as a calcium additive and to raise the pH. Because on the East Coast, you usually need to raise the pH. And so a way to add calcium and raise the pH is to add lime. A way to add calcium and not raise the pH, which is what you usually need to do here, is to add gypsum. Gypsum does not raise the pH, but it adds calcium. And gypsum also loosens up clay soil. Who cannot use that, right? So when you add gypsum to your bed, a bed like this, for instance, how much gypsum would you guess you would need to add to that bed?
A cup?
A cup? No.
40 pounds.
About 40 pounds, right?
Oh my Lord.
Yeah.
A bag.
And they come in a bag of 40
It's cheap. It's cheap and it comes in big bags, right? And one of the reasons is because it's an inorganic substance, that calcium in there has to be made bioavailable by microorganisms. And that's a very slow process. It will literally take years. It takes years to make all the calcium in there bioavailable to the plants. So that's why you throw a 40-pound bag in there, because the calcium that's made bioavailable in the first year of that 40-pound bag is maybe a fifth at the most, because the microorganisms have to chelate that first. And that's a slow process, right? So when you grow tomatoes and you have blossom end rot, which is usually a sign of calcium deficiency, throwing some gypsum in that soil is not going to stop your blossom end rot overnight. That has to be added to the soil before you plant your tomatoes, preferably the year before you plant your tomatoes, right? Just so you know, people are used to, in our time, we're used to instant solutions, right? It's not an instant solution. If you want an instant solution, you can buy a soluble calcium spray for a lot of money at Ag Unlimited. Or now it's called Grow West, right? So they do sell a 5-gallon bucket of calcium spray for like probably $150 or so, right? So it's much cheaper to just think ahead and add some of that stuff.
Or save the water from hard boiling your eggs?
Well, people say, well, just throw eggshells in there. Now, yeah, eggshells.
throw a banana peel into.
Oh, yeah.
The eggshells are great, but just like the gypsum, the calcium in those eggshells is not bioavailable at all. If you throw an eggshell in your compost, you'll realize that after a year it still looks exactly the same. What does that tell you? It tells you that it takes a very long time to decompose and make that calcium bioavailable. It has to be, microbes usually exude acids. What do we mean with exude? That's a very fine term for poop and pee, right? Microbes, exudations, are usually of an acidic nature, And the acid dissolves that eggshell slowly, slowly over time, over a matter of years. So the smaller you can crush that eggshell, the better it will be. So never just throw a half an eggshell in there and expect anything from it. It'll take 10 years before that half an eggshell, before the calcium in that half an eggshell becomes available to your plants. So if nothing else, crush your eggshells and put it in the compost. And the increased microbial activity in the compost will get some of the calcium out of that eggshells. So it's something you need to do constantly, and it takes time. So if you need calcium right away because you're planting, let's say you're planting San Marzano tomatoes. San Marzano tomatoes need way more calcium than most other tomatoes, I found, if you don't want to have blossom end rot. So adding a couple of eggshells to your soil is going to do zilch for that immediately, maybe in a few years from now. So you need to add a lot of that gypsum, ideally long before you plant. And if necessary, you can dissolve your eggshells with a little vinegar, lemon juice, and thereby get the calcium, blend them up. There's ways to do that.
So, if I add gypsum this year,
Yeah.
it's still not,
If you add it before planting, you'll get some of the calcium out of it, but only a very little bit, But if, let's say you add a 40-pound bag of gypsum to that bed before you plant your tomatoes, you'll probably be okay. Because out of the 40 plants, you may get enough out of it to prevent blossom end rot on your tomatoes. If you're just throwing a container full like that of gypsum in there, that will virtually do nothing, or almost nothing, right? So this is just give people an idea, because people think throw a handful of that in a bed like that is going to do something. It's not. So we're in the inorganic amendments. Okay, gypsum, elemental sulfur, we already talked about. Wood ashes are super alkalizing. So if you have alkaline soil, probably not an amendment you want to use. So it's like, and I want to warn people against, you go online and there's some gardening blog, some gardening channel, and they say, wood ashes are the best thing since sliced bread. It's made my garden explode. Well, you don't realize that that person lives in the UK or in Pennsylvania or, somewhere where they had very acidic soil, and wood ashes was like a godsend for them. Well, if you're somewhere where your soil is already too alkaline, it's not going to do anything good for you. So when you get gardening information from a place like that, keep in mind where they're from and what their growing conditions are. That may not be anything that works for you. So there's a lot of examples like that, but that's just one. Sand, okay. Never add sand to clay soil to try to make it fluffier. It will result in cement-like consistency. As a matter of fact, yeah, I don't use sand as a soil amendment at all because we have clay soil all over Lake County. So sand is not a soil amendment you want here. Forget about it. Plus, it's super expensive now because sand is a rarity on planet Earth now. The United Arab Emirates are buying sand from California for a lot of money. And you would think, oh, they have the Sahara there. Why don't they take the sand from there? Well, that's not the right grain size for construction. They need our sand because it has the right grain size. I bought a truckload of sand for construction, I want to say more than 10 years ago. It was $800 already, more than 10 years ago, just for sand. So not only is it not a great amendment, it's way too expensive. So for that money, I could have bought 10 truckloads of compost and gotten a much better deal, right? So perlite and vermiculite is basically exploded rock through heat, are very good to get more air in your soil. When you buy a seed starting mix, there's almost always perlite or vermiculite or, whatever in there. I don't know if I have a seed starting mix here.
perlite.
This is perlite. You can pass it around so you can look at it. Orchid mix. Let's see what was in there. Ingredients. Nope, didn't have that in there. But most seed starting mixes will have perlite or vermiculite in them to create air spaces, right? What you could use instead of the perlite or vermiculite to create air spaces is lava rock. And we have a quarry here that, sells lava rock, and I found plant roots love lava rock for some reason. So that is a great replacement for perlite or vermiculite. Rock dusts are usually an amendment to add extra minerals. If you think your soil is missing a lot of trace minerals, that may be a good amendment to add. I find them usually prohibitively expensive. That is the drawback, right? So you're usually better off just using more compost because you're getting the same trace minerals with the compost plus a lot of other benefits that you don't get from the expensive rock dust. Now, how you actually do that, hang on a second, how to improve. I want to talk a little bit about composting while we have the time, okay? We did a lot about soil structure, texture, and so on. Composting, I have normally a PowerPoint presentation that I show for that, but since we're outdoors, I brought a book. This is a very nice book that has great pictures in it, so I'm going to pass that around. You can look at some of the pictures. And when we talk about compost piles, which I already said is a misnomer in Lake County because I do not recommend composting in piles, the closest thing to a simple compost pile that would work in Lake County in the cool season is just a cylinder made out of hardware cloth. And in the cool season, if we have enough rain, you can throw stuff in there and it'll actually decompose reasonably well during the cool season there.
You're saying hardware cloth because it breathes? Because it gets out?
No, because it's the cheapest way to make a compost container. That's all. Like just take some wire, make a cylinder out of it and throw your stuff in there. That's the cheapest way to contain some compost. Only works in the cool season in Lake County because otherwise, as you can imagine, it dries out almost instantly, right? So I like to compost in various bins, and I'm sure you've all seen the many types of different composting bins that are available now. Some of them are square black plastic, some of them are round black plastic. There's tumblers with a crank, tumblers that you can roll on the ground. I mean, I have one of everything because composting was literally one of my hobbies, right? I have a double barrel crank tumbler. I have a single barrel rolling tumbler. I have another tumbler that's made out of a full barrel that's on an axis where you can push it this way. Then I have a square black bin. I have a round black bin. I mean, I have every composter you can imagine. And you know what? They all work. They all work. Yeah.
So the square ones, I have one that you like stick the sticks in and then take them out to aerate it.
Well, that's another thing. So, one thing, I don't want to go into the compost subject deeply right now, but making a hot, what used to be called a hot compost pile, okay? Hot means fast decomposing because it reaches anywhere from 110 to 150 degrees over a period of time. And of course, at that temperature, microorganisms work faster than at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, obviously, right? So if you want a fast decomposing compost, there are certain requirements. One requirement is it needs to be a minimum of 3 by 3 by 3 feet. If you don't have that size, it cannot hold on to enough heat to keep that heat going. Anything smaller than that will cool down too fast. Secondly, it needs to be composed of greens and browns in a ratio of 50-50 by volume. Okay, meaning, does everybody know what the difference is between greens and browns? We talked a little bit about it, right? Greens are nitrogen-rich, juicy material, fresh. And we're talking relatively nitrogen-rich. I'm not talking about a steak here. I'm talking about grass clippings, you know what I mean? So, relatively. Because steaks are made out of grass clippings. Cows eat grass and make a steak out of it, right?
Yeah.
So, that's where the nitrogen is, in the fresh grass. So anyway, everything that's like fresh, juicy, full of nitrogen is called a green, whether it's green colored or not. Everything that's dry, high in carbon, is called a brown, whether it's brown or not. Most of it is brown, right? And those two need to be mixed 50-50 by volume in order to get a ratio of carbon to nitrogen 30:1. That's the ratio bacteria like. Decomposing bacteria like that ratio in their food. But you don't have to remember to 30:1. You just have to remember 50-50 greens and browns by volume, which is nice because that's easy to remember. So one way to do that is just to layer. You know, one layer brown, one layer green, one layer brown, one layer green. And you want to make the layers not any thicker than like a couple inches max, because they have to be able to intermingle. So let's say you have a black bin, one of those big black 4x4x4 plastic bins. I always start out I put that number 1. Some of them come with a bottom plastic sheet that creates a barrier at the bottom. If you do not have a barrier at the bottom, gophers will eat every good thing you put into that plastic bin within a very short time, I found out. Or ground squirrels. You will lose everything. So it needs to have a barrier at the bottom in Lake County. So I actually put mine on a concrete slab, right? But you could put some other barrier at the bottom. And in order to ensure,
Like the hardware cloth or something like that?
yeah, but between the hardware cloth and the bin, as you put stuff in, the bin actually sometimes, how should I say, the spaces will form. Spaces will form where things can get in. Let's just say that. Okay. So it needs to sit solidly on that bottom barrier. And in order to prevent water from pooling at the bottom and create anaerobic conditions, which we don't want, I put all the coarse material, like, sunflower stalks or anything that's kind of a coarse stalk that traps air. I put a 2-inch layer of coarse stalks of stuff at the bottom that traps air and prevents anaerobic conditions. That's the first layer. And then I layer greens and browns, green, brown, green, brown, green, brown. In the olden days, they used to recommend to add a layer of soil as an inoculant between every green and brown. I found that's not necessary. Every plant material that you have from your garden already has the dried bacteria on it in a dormant form. And especially the fresh stuff has live bacteria on it. So you don't need the soil layer. You can add it if you want. If you have some old potting soil that's devoid of nutrients and you don't know what to do with it, layer it in your compost by all means. But you don't need it.
Is fermentation and composting at all similar?
Fermentation is decomposition in an anaerobic way. Fermentation usually happens anaerobically. Composting, at least the way we're trying to do it, should be aerobic, because otherwise it'll smell bad, okay? And fermentation is decomposition in a controlled way that has been inoculated with specific bacteria we like. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, different bacteria. Well, but,
And yeasts, not just bacteria, but yeasts. Now listen. It's really easy to understand, and I'm going to...
I think I'm fermenting.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm composting then.
You may be fermenting also, yeah. But fermenting is usually anaerobic. And you will smell it.
Alcohol without air.
Alcohol is when you ferment with yeast, not with bacteria.
Right, but like if I...
Yeah.
Oh, yes, right.
Alcohol uses yeast.
The water in the yeast. Yes.
Yeah.
And the fermentation
So,
has to be...
when you make sauerkraut, you ferment with lactic acid bacteria.
Yes.
When you make alcohol, you ferment with yeast.
Right.
That's the difference.
But the difference between composting and fermenting is one is with oxygen and one is without oxygen. So you're using different organisms to...
Right. We are trying to nourish and keep aerobic bacteria in our compost.
Yes.
Simply because we don't like the foul smell of the anaerobic bacteria. That's the main reason, right? Question?
From a practical standpoint, I mean, I understand, layering and all that
Yeah.
stuff, but in a normal household,
Yes.
I'm not going to have...
I'm going to get to that.
Thank you.
I'm going to get to that. Thanks. So I'm talking about the ideal hot compost that almost no master gardener I know ever makes. But that's how they teach it to us in school. So you layer browns and greens, 50-50 by volume. and then you water it so it's 45% moisture, okay? And then you turn it after a week because the outer edges aren't going to be as warm as the inside and vice versa. So every week you turn it for 4 weeks. And by that time it's almost completely decomposed, and then you let it sit for another month just for it to kind of calm down, basically, and then you have perfect compost. That's the ideal, perfect hot composting method. Hardly anybody I know does that. Why? Nobody has the right amount of greens and browns handy at any given time to create such a compost pile, right? So what people usually do, they get one of those black bins and they throw whatever comes out of their kitchen in there. And within a short time, they have a slimy, stinking mess in there in the winter. In the summer, they look in there and everything's dried out and nothing has happened. You can still identify every single apple peel, every single, onion skin, whatever you threw in there. So the reason is, in the summer, it dries out too much. People don't keep it moist. It's not composting. In the winter time, it turns anaerobic because they don't add enough browns. So the stuff will compact and become anaerobic and turn into a slimy blob and smell very bad. Okay. So whenever it starts smelling bad, you have that in your handout in your troubleshooting section. When it starts smelling bad, you know it's anaerobic. What do you need to do in that case? You need to add more brown matter and you need to fluff it up to get oxygen in there. Look in the troubleshooting section in the compost handout. If it's not doing anything at all, it's either because it's too dry or because you didn't add enough greens, meaning the bacteria only have dry cornflakes to eat. They like some protein with it, okay? So add more greens if it's doing nothing, or moisten it regularly. You cannot say, oh, well, today I'm moistening it and then maybe next month I'll moisten it again. It needs to perpetually be at 45% moisture to work, which is hard to do in a Lake County summer, I know. Almost impossible, right? So I have actually, that's why I place my compost tumbler near where the hose is. And when I throw new material in, I check for moisture and I moisten it down with my hose before I close it up. Because literally in the summer, it'll dry out in a day. Yeah. You cannot keep that stuff moist without adding. Now, of course, you don't want to add too much water, because you add too much water, you wash all the nutrients out with the water that's going to drip out in the bottom. And some companies have thought about that. So my compost tumbler that gets, or is supposed to be rolled on the ground, it's like basically a barrel that sits on a basin that has rolls on it, where you can even roll it on that basin. And what they did is they have holes in the barrel and they have holes in the basin. So whatever juices come out of that barrel are caught in that catch basin. So you're not losing your nutrient-rich liquids, because that's the good stuff that's coming out of there. Huh?
That could become your tea.
Yeah, I mean, we call it tea. It's not tea.
Right.
And if you compost with worms, I brought a worm composter just to show you. So remember now, if you do not do the perfect hot compost, and if you just throw things in as you go, it'll also decompose. But instead of 3 or 4 weeks, it'll take a year. That is the difference. It will eventually decompose, but it's much slower, especially if you don't turn it. It'll take a long time, but it will eventually decompose, right? So for people who live in an apartment and cannot have a compost container, worm composting is a great way to get rid of your food scraps actually much faster, And the nice thing about worm composting is that you don't need to worry about greens and browns layering alternately. What you do is you fill and most worm composters, there's no actually worms in there right now. I have the worms in a separate thing, so I didn't want to gross you out. So, but what you do is you fill your bin with shredded browns. That's called the bedding. Can you all see that? What these are ripped up egg cartons. Egg cartons, when you get them moist, are really easy to rip up. And that's the favorite bedding my worms love. So, but it could be some other shredded newspaper or whatever. But I rip those up, get them nice and moist like a wrung out sponge, and I put much more in. This is just a little to show you what I'm using. But I would fill that whole thing 2/3 with these ripped up egg cartons. And then I inoculate it with some worms. And if you're getting worms from the fishing store and you're just starting out with 7 worms, it's going to take you a long time to build up to a worm population that will eat a significant amount of compost. So it's much better to start out with a pound of worms. A pound of worms within a couple of weeks will eat a pound of compost in a couple of days. Whereas if you only have 7 worms in there, not much will happen for a long time, you know. So, and the difference between that and a regular compost is you don't have to worry about layering greens and browns. You start out with 2/3 of the container full of the brown, which is called bedding. And then you open up the bedding and you tuck a handful of greens in there, meaning kitchen scraps. Kitchen scraps are usually greens, juicy, high nitrogen stuff, including eggshells and you know whatnot. So what you do is you make a little hole in your browns and you tuck the kitchen scraps in there and you bury it. You bury it because worms don't like light. They're not going to feed on top, especially not if you're looking at them, right? They want to have some privacy when they eat. So they're gonna crawl in there and they're gonna find these kitchen scraps. And in the beginning, when you're starting out, you kind of check out how long it takes for your worms to eat that ball of scraps. Because if you put too much stuff in there, it will start rotting and smelling. So if you find out that the amounts of worms you have can eat a cupful of scraps in a day, then you know you can put a cupful in there every day. After a while, your worms will multiply if they're happy in there. Pretty soon you'll have 2 pounds of worms in there, and then they can eat much more scraps, right? So, but start out slow. Don't overwhelm them with food. The reason why these containers are usually, and this only has 2 stacks. I have one that has a seven different layers stacked on top of each other. The reason why they look like that is because worms, when they have eaten everything in one layer and there is a sufficient amount of worm poop in there, they don't want to live there anymore. So once the worm, it's called castings, it's just worm poop. Once the worm poop has reached a significant density, they don't want to have that much poop in their bedding. They move upwards. Worms always move upwards to look for greener pastures or whatever you want to call it, right? And that's why these things are being stacked. So once they're done with that, you put another bin filled 2/3 with browns in there on top, and you leave the bottom. Just leave it there because there's still a bunch of worms in there. It'll take them a while for all of them to get out of there into the upper one. And so you do the same thing with this. Fill it with bedding and then tuck juicy bits into the bedding for them to eat. And once you see there's a lot of poop in there, then you put another one on top, and you can do as many layers as you like, right? But at some point, after a couple months, I take the bottom layer out because by that time all the worms have moved out of it. And then the bottom layer is ready to use compost. Now, in the meantime, while I've been doing all that, juicy liquid has been gathering in that bottom bin. This is the catch. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that was kind of silly. But worm tea, as we call it, has been gathering in the bottom catch basin. And it's super important to empty that out all the time. Because if you don't empty that out, what happens is the water will be, see how far that goes down? The worms will be sitting in the liquid if you don't empty that out, and they will literally drown. Okay? So you need to empty that out on a regular basis. There's a spigot there. And what you do with that worm tea, you dilute it like 1 part of worm tea to at least 8 parts of water. And then you fertilize your vegetables with it, or your house plants, or whatever you want to fertilize. Don't use it undiluted. It can be quite strong and concentrated. You can actually hurt plant roots if you use it concentrated. It's very high nutrient. So you want to dilute it with water. So here you have your liquid fertilizer coming out of here. And then let's say you're already filling stack number 5. At that point you can take stack number 1 out and distribute it in your planting beds or make a new batch of soil with it, and on, right? So this is how worm composting works, and there's a lot more information in your handout about that.
How rat friendly is worm? Like you have that setting up.
So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the pitfalls and the troubleshooting. And in the meantime, if somebody wants to look at the worms, I brought a few of them. I didn't want to traumatize the whole batch, but I brought a few of them here so you can kind of look at composting worms. And composting worms are not night crawlers, okay? Night crawlers don't make good composting worms. You can pass it around. Don't traumatize them too much, but pass it around. So there's...
Is there any problem with these getting in with our wild worms and causing
There are no... Thank you for that question. No, that's a very good question because it reminds me. There are no wild worms in California.
Oh.
There used to be 0 worms on this continent. They're all imported.
Oh my word. That just blew my mind.
Yeah, there were no worms
What
here.
filled that niche?
But there was other creepy crawlies loosening up the soil, but there were no worms. And while we're on the subject, there is a very invasive worm species on the East Coast already that came, I believe, from Asia. They're called jumping worms. And they eat so much faster than all the other worms that they literally have eaten all the organic matter in forests to the point of actually creating a problem with not being enough organic matter in the forest left, because those invasive worms have eaten at very rapid speed all the organic matter. You do not want them in your garden. They also call them jumping worms because when you dig them up in the soil, they will literally jump up.
Isn't there one with a hammerhead that's bad?
That's another invasive worm. The hammerhead worm is another invasive worm, yeah. But that's not who we're talking about here. These are called red worms or manure worms. And they came in with literally manure because in nature they live under manure. When a horse poops, these worms can only live in a very high nutrient environment. They would not survive out in the native soil.
Do they have teeth?
No, they don't have teeth. So the worms we use for composting cannot survive out in nature because there's not enough nutrients for them. They can only survive in high nutrient. Huh?
Oh, they die? Okay. If you cut them in half, I wondered if they...
Let's not get into that today. Okay, let's not get into that today. That's a whole other thing. But so the reason we want them for composting is because a compost is a high nutrient environment. That's where they like to live. They don't want to live just somewhere out in the soil. Whereas your night crawlers, the long, they can live anywhere in your soil, and they're usually down 6 feet deep in the summer. You won't ever see them. Whereas these red worms, you can find them under a horse paddy, under a cow paddy. That's where they occur, not in nature, but in human environments, right? Like wherever there's manure, you would find them. But they're not just crawling around wild in the forest.
I find them on, if you have a carpet, old carpet laying around the grass or something, or even cardboard, you lift it up and they're under there.
Yeah, wherever there's moisture and nutrients.
So they are around somewhere to come.
Yeah. So anyway, so you notice that the red worms, they're not long. They're, not super long worms. They're fairly short. And there's 2 or 3 different species of composting worms. In this batch that there's 2 different species in there. Where is it now? Here. There is the really short, thick ones, and there's the little bit longer, really dark red ones in there. I think it's the really longer, dark red ones are called Eisenia fetida. And I forgot the name of the short, stubby ones. Anyway. Rucus rebellus, right. So there's like 2 or 3 different species that like this kind of environment that we use for composting. So not any old worm will do here, right? Now the troubleshooting, or things that can go wrong, okay? There's many things that can go wrong. The first thing I noticed when I did this on a larger... I had 2 of those in my house over winter. And in the fall, so it started out in the fall after the pear festival, I had all this pear residue that I thought, fantastic, my worms will love that. So I tucked rotting pear scraps in my composter, and And I remember one day I came home from Lakeport and there was literally 10,000 fruit flies in the room where my composter was. The windows were covered in fruit flies, the curtains were covered in fruit flies, and they were just buzzing around the room, you know, there was fruit flies everywhere. So I learned that if you keep this indoors, do not add fruit scraps unless you first freeze them for 2 weeks to kill the fruit fly eggs. Okay? Because you will have fruit flies like there's no tomorrow. And fruit fly eggs are literally on every piece of fruit you buy, even if you don't see them. They are there. And given the right conditions, they will hatch in large numbers, right? So don't add your fruit scraps to your composter if you keep that thing indoors, ever. So for a while, I used to take it out in front of the door, open the lid, add the stuff, put the lid on, bring it back in. And then I thought, I'm just not going to put any fruit in there anymore. It's easier. So nowadays, I don't keep them indoors at all anymore unless it's winter and it's very cold outside. Then I bring it in. But, you know, anytime we have semi-decent weather, this lives outside, right? Now, the other thing that can happen is I noticed one day the lid was off and everything good was missing. The only thing was left was a little cardboard. And I realized one of my dogs had learned how to open the lid and help himself to these yummy worms and all the good kitchen scraps, right?
No kisses for that dog.
Yeah, right. So dogs and other critters will be able to open that, no doubt, and take out what they like, right? So keep that also in mind. Raccoons. So put something heavy on it if you have it outside, you know, some heavy weight. The other thing that can happen is that if you put something in there that totally disturbs the pH, like something very acidic. Worms don't like really acidic stuff, I noticed. Okay, so like grape pomace or things like that. You cannot add to that. It's too acidic. Or any other fruit residue that's highly acidic. They don't like that. That's actually the most important drawbacks. The other drawback, obviously, is it can dry out. So you still need to check, make sure that it's 45%, water, meaning as moist as a wrung-out sponge. And then the other main drawback is not emptying the bottom catch bin too often. It has happened to me that I put a lot of juicy stuff up there, and within one day, that thing was full at the bottom. And the bottom 2 inches of the worm bin were sitting in that liquid. And then it'll immediately become anaerobic and start smelling. You don't want that. Not to mention it will kill the worms that get caught there, right? So.
It's 1 o'clock. And then
Yeah.
the other question is,
Thank you.
temperature, you were saying, what kind of
Thank
temperature
you.
can they survive on the water?
Thank you. Another important thing. Worms like the exact same temperature that humans like. Isn't that nice? So that's when they feel best, is when we feel best. Now, they can survive, obviously, colder or hotter temperature. But what I found is when it's significantly colder or significantly hotter, they don't feed. They just kind of gather in the middle of the bin in a ball, literally. They like when it's cold outside, they crawl all in the middle of the bin and they crawl into a ball to keep themselves warm. And they will not feed or crawl around during that time. They will also not mate. So if you want your worm bin to be active and multiply, you have to keep it in a temperature range that's semi-comfortable for you, you know. The other thing is they hate light and they hate vibration. Do not put it next to your washing machine, because when that goes in the spin cycle, that vibration, they absolutely hate that. They will get terrified and be like in shock for 2 weeks after that, right? So worms, when they are exposed to things they hate, they will go into temporary shock, I could say, and they don't eat for a while. So try not to stress them out. Otherwise, they're easy pets, right? But they don't like light. Now, a good way to use light is when you first create your worm bin, you know, you notice that this is not hermetically sealed here, right? I mean, it can happen that the occasional worm will try to crawl out. And so the first few days I have the bin, I have a lamp there and I'm shining a bright light on that worm bin. And that'll prevent them from wanting to crawl out because they see it's light out there. They don't want to go where it's light. They will stay in the dark bin. And then after a couple of days, they are conditioned to stay in that dark bin. I have, like the elephant that's like, bound by a tiny little stick. So anyway, if you do that for a few days in the beginning, they will stay in the bin from then on. There may be exceptions, but in general, that's how it works. There's a lot of other interesting things about worms that we don't need to know in order for it to work. Worms are hermaphroditic. They are both male and female at the same time. They still mate because they do want to exchange chromosomes. They don't like incest, right? So there's a lot of interesting things about worms. But like I said, we don't have to get into that. The important part is how to treat them, how they like to be treated in order to do the job you want them to do, which is process scraps and turn it into worm castings, which is a really high nutrient fertilizer. So the worm castings is their poop, which will basically, you can see it right here. Can you see all the, it's dried up now, of course, but I'm going to make a round here. See all that stuff that's on top of the cardboard? That's dried worm poop.
Oh, wow.
Can you see that? It's a very high nutrient fertilizer. See the stuff on, this is dried worm castings. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
It's these little tiny sausages, right?
Yeah. Cool.
Casting, where's the casting?
Poop.
Oh, poop. All
It's a
that?
fancy name for poop.
All
No,
that?
not all that. These are cardboard. That's egg cartons. But I'm saying all the little, all that little, that drowned,
all that. Oh,
dried
okay.
worm turds, basically.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay.
Very good.
This is the egg cartons, and that is all dried worm turds.
Wow.
Okay.
Amazing.
So this is one of the highest nitrogen fertilizers. So if you don't dilute it properly, you can actually burn your plant roots with it. And so it's one of the great ways of making fertilizer tea, which was another class I taught. That's still on video. You can watch it on video.
How do you dilute it?
How do you dilute it?
Where do you dilute
Just
it?
1 to 8 with water.
With water.
Yeah. Non-chlorinated water, obviously. Not obviously, but yeah.
Not potable. So it can't. Well, it has to be potable, but not chlorinated.
It doesn't have to be potable at all.
Brackish?
Plants. Oh yeah, I'm glad he brought that up. It's not related to soil, but can you all listen for a second? Julia. Sorry. He brought a very interesting thing up that I want to mention because it is interesting. People are sometimes under the impression that plants need potable water. They don't. We need potable water. Plants don't need potable water. You can feed plants gray water. They don't care. They want the nutrients in the water. What they don't want is chlorine, right? But they don't care if you peed in it or not, as long as it's not too concentrated, So plants do not need potable water. Don't waste your drinking water on your plants if you don't, if you have gray water that you can use. That's a misconception, right? The chlorine is what we don't want in it. Otherwise, if it has dirt in it, plants don't care. They live in dirt, And why don't we want the chlorine in it? Every one of you knows that now. Why don't we want the chlorine in it? It kills the microorganisms, right? Which are the ones that are doing all the work in the soil. So we don't want to kill them. So that is the gist of it. We can do a little Q&A, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah. So we're gonna try to do this. So we have a Garden 2026 Garden Class Survey. So after each class, I usually have you write out the survey. So if you have your